This is a series of courses called Hubris and Atonement, to the state of Israel and Jewish people in 1972-75. Michael and Avi know this subject pretty well. Hopefully they'll learn a little bit tonight. None are as blind as those who went out to see the Buildup, see Yom Kippur War. One of the most tragic aspects of it is precisely the fact that this is something somebody should have seen coming, but it ain't the only time that happened, as I'll try to make the case tonight. So this is the fourth lecture over here, and now I'll get down to work. I start by pointing out that now it's 1948 to 2018, almost. So that's 70 years. Wow. That affords us the ability to observe certain patterns in the Arab-Israeli conflict. One pattern, this is very important, is in the absence of a perceived political process of some sort, a war breaks out, with or without the intentionality of the protagonist. This is a basic cycle you see repeated in Arab-Israeli history, maybe in other places also. I mean, going back to these times, the war broke out when there was no chance of any kind of political process in the 50s. To be very exact, some of you may perhaps remember, is this working? Can you all hear me? Yeah, it's not working. Yeah. And Bill left. Okay. Hello? Hello? I'll try it again. Thank you for sharing that. Hello? 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 A lot of heavy water. How are we doing now? Hello? Hello? Ben Gurion. Nasser. How about now? How about now? Basic nicht. I am Bill checked out. How about now? What I'll end up doing is shouting, that's all. I'll be like my shul. Hello, 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 hello. How about now? How about now? How about now? Hello, hello, hello. That's it. Hello? Hello? Any other sound specialists here? Any other sound specialists here?
Well, we know which one is loose.
Yeah. Story of my life. Hello? 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 How about now? Jake, can you record if it's not loud? Then I'll just do it like this, because I can't keep everybody waiting. How about now? All right. I'll end up shouting it. And oh. Let's use it while it works, okay? So, okay, that's it. What I was saying was that if you recall the details, Eisenhower actually had secret talks going on, and then they failed, and then the war broke out in '56. That's literally what happened if you know the blow-by-blow description. Again, go to the next one. You know, where when LBJ was in office, because he was so pro-Israel, there was no real peace process going on, and the war broke out. There are other cases as well. It makes it scary now. When the peace process broke down in 10 years ago, whatever it was, this stupid war broke out. But that wasn't planned. I mean, if you know the details, and I know the Glazers know the details, you know, if you know the details, it wasn't like part of a long plan. It's just that things are always so volatile there, they could stop. It could start tomorrow. So it's just something. Let me put it this way: it's something to keep in mind, because we're all worried, you know, if Trump's going to make a process or not a process, and this, and that, and the other. And speaking very cynically and very frankly, the best thing for Israel is there should be a peace process going, but nothing happens, you know, that kind of thing. But the absence of one has never been good. As I explained last time, during the early Nixon years, there was no real peace process. The Ruskies were frozen out to their great displeasure because of their lack of diplomatic relations with Israel, their complete identification with the Arab side, and their anti-Semitism. I mean, these were in Soviet magazines, and nothing happens there without the government agreeing to it. These are anti-Semitic cartoons, obviously. So, okay, if you're going to do that, then don't tell me that Israel should, you know, negotiate with you in a serious way, because it's clear whose corner you're in. This was a strategic error on the part of the Soviets, but they couldn't help making it, because, as we know, anti-Semitism is in the DNA of the Soviet leadership. Putin is very different in that regard. It's actually quite remarkable. Whatever his other problems are, anti-Semitism is not one of them. It's one of the most, to my mind, extraordinary phenomena of the modern era. Like I say, Russia's got its issues and all that, internationally and otherwise. But you know, he decided, you know, not to go against the Jews. But the old system, as we all know, under the communists, even if it was against their end, they couldn't help trying to suppress the matzah. They couldn't help trying to suppress the synagogue, even though it didn't matter, you see. And if they would have played ball with Israel to some degree, they would have been majorly influential in the process. But of course, they couldn't help it. The most the Soviets could bring themselves to do, the most they would allow their brain to prevail over heart, was to tolerate benignly the Romania connection. If anybody remembers Romania, with Soviet approval, because they were a satellite. I don't care what the media used to say. They were next door to Russia, and if they allow, here's Golda Meir in the synagogue on Friday night in Romania when she made a dramatic visit, I think in 71 or 72, whatever you had, 72. And what's that all about? That was the most the Russians could do, to say, well, we're, you know, not anti-Semitic like Hitler or something like that, and so we'll allow, but it wasn't enough. You couldn't build on this to actually develop a real role for the Soviets, for Gromyko and those guys, in the peace process. And it's also true, Romania did this all to suck up to Nixon, right? Because if you're old enough to remember, Nixon had a very famous visit to Romania when he became president in 1969. It was a big splash, and the media used to say, well, Romania is really a progressive country, they're opening up to the West, which is a lie, but that was a very popular way of presenting the issues over there. Look, the Romanians did this, invite Golda Meir because the Russians allowed them to do so, and also because Romanians want to kiss up to Nixon, and after all, they know that the Jews control America. That's who America is. It's a very famous thing with General Antonescu, who was the fascist dictator of Romania during the Hitler era in World War II. He was shot later on. And Antonescu, Roosevelt in '44, when he finally got off his rear end, said, all right, we're going to appoint a commission to try to help the Jews, the Refugee Commission. And in 1944, so we talked about it long ago. Maybe it's a little too late, but it's never too late to do something. And he sent somebody to Romania, a secret envoy. And Antonescu said, why does the President of the United States want to send a personal representative to negotiate on behalf of Jews? He couldn't understand that. And the guy said, I know you don't understand. That's why the U.S. is where it is today, the most powerful nation in the country. And that's why Romania is where it is today, which is the weakest, poorest, and most contemptible nation in the world. You know, so we understand who we're dealing with. the State Department, as I tried to point out, was too dumb to refrain from helping the Soviets. That's right. So Secretary Rogers and Cisco, with the best intention in the world, they're just dumb. I'm talking about 69, 70, 71, 72, 73, in those years. They thought, no, there should be four-power talks, and it should be guaranteed by all the great powers, and the Soviet Union should be an absolute partner in all negotiations. You probably don't go back to remember all this, but it's easy. You can just get it at the touch of a button. I remember it. And we want, does this recall anything? They want a Geneva conference in which all the great powers will be represented, which is another way of saying that the Soviets can exercise their influence on behalf of their clients, and the State Department won't play the same role for Israel, but the State Department will be the neutral guy. So no, that's what they consider to be a fair kind of business. As a result, the State Department constantly, Kissinger has all the gory details in his fat memoirs. The State Department constantly, 69, 71, 71, 72, was always saying like this: let's restart the process, let's have the Rogers plan, let's have a new plan, let's get Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories in exchange for not exactly a peace, but some kind of non-belligerency agreement, and we'll do something for the Palestinians. In other words, there's three quarters on the Arab side, and they thought that Israel's the one that's being intransigent. Fortunately for Israel, in those years, as I've pointed out before, the State Department had no say, really. You understand? All the foreign policy was concentrated in the Oval Office, as we say today. It was Nixon and Kissinger, and they were not interested in helping the Soviets at all. Why should we, facilitate a situation in which the interests of all the great powers, including the Soviets, are helped in the Middle East? They're our enemies. Why would we want to do that? As a result, there wasn't a real peace process during the first 5 years of Nixon. This was immensely distressful to the Arabs, right? Drove Sadat crazy every time he saw this sort of thing because they couldn't understand it. Why is the United States the only country, and was the only country, that's in Israel's corner when everybody else should be, all the other ducks are lined up in a row? And so it was the opposite of stressful to the Israelis. They were getting to keep their empire because they used to like that big map, you understand? And the dirty truth is that they want to give up an inch, at least in their mind. Now, Nasser, when he was alive, had announced that soon, right after the Six-Day War actually, that he was going to get his lands back and he was going to rebuild his army and refight the war. This time the Jews would not be able to surprise attack him, and that was the only reason that they had won the war. And Nasser, as we saw last year, did undertake a massive rebuilding of the Egyptian military with the enthusiastic support of the patriotic Egyptian people. The Egyptian people were really all nationalistic. They didn't say, oy vey, another war. They said, no, we should, tomorrow we should have the war. And this war of attrition that we talked about last year, when each side did these raids and stuff like that on the other side, was a reflection of what I was talking about. But then Nasser dropped dead. And so the Israelis could feel that his danger was gone, and there would be no one in the Arab leadership who would have Nasser's sense of urgency. The Israelis and the rest of the world did not know who Anwar Sadat was, because he did have this. But it's understandable because he had just been a crony, right? There's Sadat, there's Nasser, and what does that look like, He didn't look like an impressive kind of a figure over there. Now, just a crony. Sadat, as we all know, surprised everyone. He maneuvered his rivals out of power, but he realized that although he was a dictator, and let's get one thing straight, all the Arab countries have dictators. They call it what they want, one form or another, but it's one form of a dictatorship or the other. That's how it goes. But he needed an earthy and genuine legitimacy. Such is the essence of what we call the fascist model of dictatorship, which is very interesting. And because fascism is such a dirty word, thanks to Hitler, so nobody understands the appeal of it, but obviously it had an appeal. And the fascist idea of dictatorship is very simple. Give me all the power, and I will benefit you. You get it? If I have all the power and total control of everything, your salary will go up. You'll get housing. The farmers will benefit. I'll give you value for what you're giving me. And in that lies the legitimacy. Aren't there Germans today? Certainly there were a generation ago of a certain age that said like this, Hitler was bad, but he made the Autobahn. He built the VWs. He helped my father or my uncle get a job. You understand? And I'm not talking about the crazy Germans. I'm somebody the middle type who said, I don't approve of the Holocaust and another, but, you can't deny it. There's other things also. Which means that it's not just an Assad situation, which I give you nothing, just give me all the power and I give you zilch, starve. But on the contrary, what you find in many authoritarian countries today, Singapore comes to mind, and places like that, in which don't mess with politics, don't involve yourself in, those kind of issues, pursue your own life, get a job. After all, as I always say, the dirty fact is how many people in this room vote. It's a wonderful, precious right. How many people actually go out and do it? Not so many. Yeah, all right, one person raised his hand. Two people. No, but you understand what I'm saying. So what that kind of, there are plenty of people in Baltimore and elsewhere who, follow the sports, and they follow the movies, and they follow all that kind of junk. And, ask them, this is like they always say, who's the president? Well, that they know now, but who's the vice president? Who's your senator in Maryland? They might not even know where Maryland is on the map. I mean, this isn't. So what they're really doing is they're saying, as long as the government gives me, what I want, it's okay. So Sadat realized this, and he realized correctly that in order for him to have a legitimacy as Egyptian national leader, instead of using the word dictator, he has to recover the Sinai, the lost lands to Israel back in the 67 war. This was his big business, his big goal. And it makes total sense. So Anwar Sadat built up the military. He took it very seriously. He gets good generals. In other words, he got generals who understand what the Egyptian military is capable of and what they're not capable of. And that's most important. Nasser had the opposite. He had people with grandiose ideas. He didn't have the military to back it up. And that's the worst thing in the world because you get into a losing war. Understand? So under Sadat in 71 and 72, they said we need a rethinking process. All this is bad for Israel. An honest appraisal of one's own strengths and weaknesses and the enemy's strengths and weaknesses is the first prerequisite to military success. So people like General Shazli, I said before, were different than this guy, Amr, who had been Nasser as the head of the military and who collapsed in the Six-Day War, if you remember last year. Just lost it. So if you have a top leadership like that, obviously you're going to lose. So you need people who can say, listen, we stink at this and we stink at that, but we're good at this and we're good at that. And you look at it realistically. And the Egyptians do have the benefit of the best Russian generals, the best Soviet minds. Okay? One thing we all know about the Soviets are, maybe they couldn't deliver the food, but the weapons they were good at. The military, I think they were the best army, as I remember growing up. There was a time when the American president said we have the best military, and then they switched under Nixon to the following language. We have a military second to none. Oh? So anyway, so the Russians and the Egyptians, mainly the Russians, they professionally analyze the Israeli enemy, the IDF, and unfortunately did a good job. Military science, if it's done scientifically, is about problem solving, right? You look at the enemy, here, who are your famous generals of the past? They're problem solvers, Here's the other side, here's what needs to be done. We have certain problems, here's how we overcome them, or don't. The successful generals figure out how to overcome them, and the other ones don't. This is actually Robert E. Lee when he was young in the what do you call it, the Mexican War, when he was the head of the engineers for General Scott. I wrote about it in the Where We Went. So, the Mexicans over here, so you go like that, and you do this, you do like that. And all these other guys, how did Rommel become famous? Because he found the hole in the French lines, It's a problem solving. Now, in problem solving, the advantage is always going to go to the burglar and not to the locksmith. You get that? To the hacker and not to the cybersecurity guy. This is how it goes. I mean, we live in the age of the hackers, as you see over here. And the reason is because the disadvantage is always with the static, and the advantage is always with the non-static. Agree? You build a lock, so now you have to sort of defend your status quo. So some smart guy figures out, or girl, figures out how to pick the lock. Today it's the cyber junk, right? You set up a system, and it's real good, and then all that means is it's a target for every creative person, because anything that a person created, another person can uncreate. So in military terms, what does that mean? You're the enemy, you have these advantages. If you're not on the offensive against me, then it's a static situation. Then what I have to figure out is, what are your advantages and how do I overcome your advantages? That's why in a well-organized military situation, the advantage is on the offense. correct? It's on the offense. Now, the Soviet-Egyptian team identified two basic strengths of the Israeli army, the Air Force and the Tank Corps. That was the two special things of Israel at that time. I'm talking about in the 70s. The Air Force, I think we know, had shown itself and was, under Ezer Weitzman in the beginning and afterwards under Mordechai Hope, they actually turned themselves one of the best. What I mean by that is like this. Instead of 10 hours of training, you make 100 hours of training, and you get very rigorous in who you accept in your Air Force Academy, and, that sort of way. Meaning you undertake, it costs a lot of money. So you have to be willing to spend a lot of money to undertake to create a quality situation, okay? So Israel had one of the best Air Force, certainly far better than anything the Egyptians had. The pilots were better. And in addition to that, Israel had built up a tank excellence, as I would call it, okay? This is General Tal, who was the Israeli Rommel, if I can use that term. And again, a very interesting person. He built it up from the bottom up. He took, I won't bore you with all the details, but he started with a situation in which they said everybody's going to have long hours in practice on this stuff. And I remember he even did a situation where everybody in the tank has to learn everybody else's job. And, gunnery practice again, and nachamal, and, you practice driving and all this kind of stuff. If you do it, again, it costs a lot of money. And, you got to weed out the losers. And you have to insist on a certain professionalism, meaning, are we in charge of the inventory? I don't want stuff to get lost. Are there logs, to keep track of everything going? There's a system to it. But he built it up. So this, again, as a result of this, the Israeli Armor Corps was much better than the Egyptian one. From the Soviet point of view then, analyzing this professionally, the question is how to trump these advantages. If this can be accomplished, Israel can be defeated from a professional military point of view. And the Soviets are, of course, correct in this. Okay, one at a time. How do you trump the Israeli Air Force? Well, here's the answer, okay? Meaning, they had the SAM-1, the SAM-2, the SAM-3, and so forth. And each one, Israel could do this and do that and do that. They figured out a way. This is what we talked about a little bit last year in the war of attrition years. The Russians used the SAM-2 missiles until Israel figured a hole in that, because then the Russians were the ones static. They had the missiles, Israel figured a way around it. However, sooner or later, the Russians who prioritized this came up with the SAM-6, not the SAM-2, 3, 4, 5, 6 one. And that was already better than the Israeli Mirage planes, than the Phantoms, better than the Phantoms. I might point out that, let's put it this way, the U.S. couldn't beat this in the Vietnam War. During 1967 to 70, the Israeli Air Force had struggled to overcome the SAM-1, 2, and 3, and the pilots managed to do so. But by the time you get to the SAM-6, the Israeli Air Force had no straightforward countermeasure. They had no straightforward, that's going to happen in technology. Although the Israeli Air Force excelled in what I would call fancy flying, the SAM-6 was designed to beat the fancy flying. So we're dealing with a business model here, with a professional situation. The U.S. Air Force, which was better than Israel's, or at least better equipped, did not have a good countermeasure to the SAM-6 in the Vietnam War. Okay? Now, both the U.S. Air Force and the Israeli Air Force did have one way of fancy flying to counter the SAM-6, but it required exquisite ballet, perfect choreography, and all the rest of it. In other words, they did practice these things where if a bunch of planes going, like this, and like this, and like that, and like that, and like that, very difficult maneuvers, and if you come in under and you come up at the last minute, and I'm not an expert in this, but as I understand it, if you have a whole bunch of SAM-6s, so you do this, and pick up one at the end. So then you have a little bit of thing, 2 at the end, and then you have a little wider, and then 3 at the end, and then you go around in the back. But it's very difficult to do that, because if you don't, it's like a ballet. If you don't do it exactly right, the whole thing falls apart. So this is the best that they could come up with. I'm talking about the U.S. Air Force and the Israeli Air Force. Other than that, there was no good answer to the SAM-6 at that time. I might say that by the 80s, Israel did have an answer to that SAM-6. That's how they shot out those 90 planes in one day, if you remember, in the Lebanon War. Remember that? Because by that time, they figured out a way around it. But we're talking now, not 1982, we're talking 72. So it wasn't there yet. Plus, the Soviets have a certain approach to quantity that is pretty doggone effective, unfortunately. I'll tell you what I mean. This is the Russian military doctrine, because Russia is a gigantic country, and that's how they fought the Germans and the Japanese and all that. That's part of their nature. How do you take on quantity? It goes like this. I'm trying to defend an area, okay? So here come the planes. So you put up an anti-aircraft missile. So you go around it, you put up 2. You go around that, you put up, what about 2,000? What if I put 1,000,000, and you know, exaggeratedly? There comes a point you can't do it. You understand? Because you have so many, then quantity becomes quality at that point. And that's what the Russians did to fight the Germans. And that was their basic military doctrine. And that's what they try to and that's what they teach the Arabs to do quite successfully, I'm sorry to say. How do you take on 1,000 missiles? It becomes a question of how many can the Soviets produce and give the Egyptians? Because they can't produce 1,000,000 of them. It costs a lot of money, but they can produce a heck of a lot. So if you have a few of these SAM-6s, that's bad enough. If you have dozens and dozens, hundreds, I don't know how many they had, it becomes impossible. Because what if I line them up one, and then another row behind it, another row behind it, and so on and so forth? You know, Stalin did that in World War II. It's very interesting. He didn't want Hitler to bomb Moscow, which the Germans did in 41. So by the time he had 42, he didn't have 2 or 3 anti-aircraft things, like 1,000 of them. The Germans went over this. It's impossible. Because if every street has 3 or 4 of these things shooting up at them, you understand? How can you do it? Now you have to be willing to starve your people in order to produce all the rest of the things. Okay, well, Stalin, you know. So I'm simply showing you that these things, you know, unfortunately do work. And one of the reasons for the Israeli defeats when they happened in the Yom Kippur War is precisely this quantity things that the Israelis just weren't aware of. They were intellectually aware of it, but they hadn't assimilated, which is something we'll have to talk about. You know, knowing something and really taking it seriously is 2 different things. And then we have the Israeli tanks, the Chel Shayim. I see we have a few people here who served in the Israeli tank corps. Now the Soviets, and again, Israel had very good tanks, or they had very effective ones. They actually had old ones. The Soviets have been dealing with the NATO tank problem for a long time, the Russians, because they had that NATO border coming right across Europe. And so in their war planning, war games, they're always figuring, here come the American tanks and the British and the German tanks and so on and so forth. And how do you deal? What's your countermeasure for that? Now, there are countermeasures for tanks. It's just very interesting. We'll have a little military lesson over here without getting too technical. First of all, you got all these different bazookas, right? You know, these guys have these things where you hold them in your hand and you shoot the tanks. They actually turned pretty doggone effective in World War II. So that's interesting. That's an interesting ballet. Who rules the battlefield? The tanks or the infantry? Now, the old-fashioned classic generals will say, oh, the tanks, because you line them all up there, and you can go into YouTube, see these old battles. You know, this regular soldier just shoots at the tank, and you can't hit them too well, especially if they're well-armored. The American tanks in World War II had junky armor, I'm sorry to say, and poor guys that served in that business, you know, under patent and all that stuff. It wasn't great. But, I mean, really criminally bad tanks. But the Russians had darn good tanks. And from the day they invaded, the Germans invaded in June of 41, they were like shocked. They hit these tanks and they bounced off. So when you do like that, and if it's 1,000 guys against 20 tanks, who's going to win? The tanks are going to win. And that's why your General Patton and Rommel and these other types won these wars when they did. But what if the infantry has bazookas of various types, whatever you want to call them? Then it's not so pashut, because here comes a tank, but this guy can knock out, and if it's a good bazooka, the right kind of thing, it can actually destroy the tank. So the Soviets start thinking like this. What if the infantry has thousands of these things? If every soldier has 1 or 2, and you have 1,000 soldiers in the battlefield or more. So then it's interesting. Then the infantry beat the tanks. Agreed? If they got so many of them, this has never happened before. Well, but the Russians were aware that the Germans took out a lot of their T-34 tanks in late World War II, and the Russians remember that. Because, as I told you before, in the beginning, the Germans had no countermeasure because the German tanks were not very good, contrary to popular belief. The Russians, this is the Dover Yadua. The Russians had the best tank in World War II. I mean, you know, even a lot of non-professional people know that. If you go to Israel, I'm not doing this time, but I bet some of you have been there in Latrun, Have you been there? And it's very interesting, where they have all this tank, museum of some kind of, all these tanks outside, all different types. And when you go in, I was there once, when you go in, at the beginning is three old tanks, a Russian, a British, American, in tribute to those who fought fascism. They must have figured this out to appeal to the Russians, or something like that. But the Russian tank's the best tank. Now, the Germans are not stupid, so by 44, 45, late in the day, they developed what they call the Panzerfaust. Yeah.
Soon they improved on the design by creating a projectile with a much larger shaped charge. With a bigger charge, the Panzerfaust could burn through even thicker armor. Once it breached the armor, the blast would incinerate the tank and its crew. It was a much more powerful weapon than our bazooka, but it wasn't longer range. Our problem with our bazooka was the shape charge was too small in diameter, but it did have a pretty good range. The German Panzerfaust had a larger shape charge, more effective now, but it had a shorter range, so you had to weigh one against the other. Another thing, the Panzerfaust could be handled by a single man, whereas the bazooka took a two-man team. We did use our bazookas against German tanks, and we knocked out some German tanks with them, but they weren't near as effective against German tanks as that Panzerfaust was against us. The German Panzerfaust was such a good weapon, we would usually capture a bunch of them, so there were plenty of them around. I say a lot of our infantry carried German Panzerfaust used them.
That's okay. You get the idea, and then it's just a question of get your tech people to work on it, right? Get one that works with one guy and with a bigger boom. So now you're talking about the Soviet Union by 1970. You see where it's going. So the countermeasure to the renowned Israeli Armored Corps is a lot of infantry with a lot of effective bazookas, or call them whatever you want. Hundreds of them, thousands of them, okay? And as I said before, this is how Stalin and Zhukov fought the war. They just gave the soldiers tons of these things. The Germans did the same business. And, quantity, as I say, becomes quality. By 1973, it's what they call the Sager, okay? Which is kind of a funny thing. It's this, and it's operated by a joystick. Believe it or not, I promise you. It's a toy, but it's a very deadly toy. And this was the technology. The Russians invented this to fight the NATO. You're saying they thought they were going to have World War III, and it's going to be in Europe. And they got big battles. And you have lots of American tanks and British tanks and things like that. And this is how we're going to knock them out. So in other words, they created a very effective, but very, what's the right word, flexible and light and usable kind of model. Here, go to the next. I mean, that's how you operate it, with the joystick. And these stupid little things destroyed 800 Israeli tanks in the war. Right? These dumb little things. They're not so dumb, you see? So all it takes is one guy with a training, of course, and they used to have like a certain suitcase in which you unpack the thing and you tie it up with a string of some kind or other. It shoots out with a string. So it's funny, except it's not funny. It looks like a toy that you give to a kid for a birthday or whatever, but it's not. And the Israeli army knows about this. These had been deployed in Europe by the Soviet army and their satellite forces since 1961, so JFK. So this was not an unknown kind of figure, but the Arabs hadn't used them yet. And now, as we'll see in a minute, in late 72, they start giving a whole bunch of them to the Egyptians. The problem with the Israeli army, which is the main problem of the war, this is a Mutzar Haskell for all of us, is that the IDF had not mentally assimilated the info, which leads to the main discussion tonight. How was Israel surprise attacked on Yom Kippur? How were they so totally duped? How did that happen? This is a fascinating human phenomenon. It's not just Israel. There are, it seems to me, 5 major successful surprise attacks I can think of in the 20th century. In each case, it should not have been a surprise, but it was. Number 1, of course, comes to mind, you got Pearl Harbor, obviously. And they're still writing books forever about it. Did Roosevelt know? Did the Army know? And, this one knew and this one didn't know. They broke the Japanese code, for example. Number 2, more surprising. How did Hitler surprise invade Stalin? Okay? There's nobody that had a better spy service than the Russians. They probably still do. Okay? For all I know, somebody in this room. He says, right? Raise your hand. And seriously. And I mean, this is very well known. This is, every baby knows this. Stalin got 100 messages from spies everywhere, and from the British, and from Roosevelt, and this, right and left and right. Hitler is going to attack you in June of 1941. And he just didn't believe it. So he didn't believe it. Mainly because the German army had no winter clothes, and it was just beyond his imagination. Hitler would launch a thing in June and not be ready for the winter. It's not possible. That was his conception. Number 3, in Korea, when they invaded, it comes to my mind, when they invaded June of 1950, the Americans were like shocked. Well, I mean, the Koreans were building up an army with, thanks to Stalin's weapons, although, why were they shocked? And then, by the way, we surprised the Russians, the communists at Incheon, didn't we? Which also they shouldn't have been surprised. MacArthur had that landing over there in the rear. How did that happen? And then in November 50, the Chinese attacked MacArthur. I think everybody knows what I'm talking about. And we got totally creamed. And again, we should have known. As a matter of fact, there's a movie from that time. I'll show you a piece in a second. There's a movie from that year, 1952, a very famous movie, Retreat Hell, I think. And so American movie. And they're showing in there what the Marines were like in 1950. And what do you call it? You'll see that the guy's saying like this. These are before the Chinese attack. He said, they were up in North Korea, and they run into Chinese soldiers. And the guy said, I don't know what they're doing here. He said, take a look at this. They have to fight. These are Marines. It's a Hollywood movie. He said, these are Marines, at the advance guard of MacArthur's army in, I think, November already, late October, November of 1950. And the Americans said, oh, it's a cakewalk, everybody will be home by Christmas. And here, all of a sudden, it's not so pashut. You see? That's a Russian tank. I mean, a Soviet type tank. And the surprise attack came after this, like a week or two. So how come they were surprised? That's my point. You understand? American forces were engaging with Chinese soldiers, and then MacArthur says, I guess, when they came into massive business, he said, I didn't know anything about this.
These soldiers are Chinese. Chinese? What are they doing here? I don't know. I don't know.
A few days later, Truman was told, MacArthur met with Truman, and he said, oh, there's not a chance the Chinese are going to get involved in Korea. So he knew what you just saw, because it's in a movie, but he didn't assimilate it. You understand? He didn't assimilate it. In the 6-Day War is a good example. How was Nasser surprised? They were building up he built the whole crisis in the first place, and he massed the Egyptian army on the other side. In each case, it's a fascinating subject. The intelligence information was there, but was not mentally assimilated by decision-making echelon. That's what you see. Whether it was Roosevelt with the Pearl Harbor, whether it was Stalin, Truman, MacArthur, Nasser. It's very interesting. Right? It's very interesting because it means it calls attention to the G2 business, the intelligence business, some of whom are in this audience tonight. And intelligence in this regard is a science, but it's an art with its own dynamics. Right? I'm not a professional in this, obviously, but I know enough to know basics, which is, first of all, you always have to ask yourself the question, how accurate is the information that you're getting? Secondly, how widely do you distribute the valuable information? There's always a big problem. Let's put it this way. In World War II, I think people know this, Churchill knew that we had the secret code, and they're going to bomb Coventry. But he let them bomb the city, because otherwise the Germans would figure out he knew the code. So he was willing to let the city get blown up. This is famous. There's a German general with that secret ultra machine. Okay? General Guderian. I'm sorry, there's the machine. Okay? The Enigma machine, yeah. So, the Allies, Churchill in this case, was willing to go to extreme lengths to hide the information. Okay? So, it becomes a question of how widely do you distribute the knowledge you know. They didn't want more than a very few people to know that they had the secrets, obviously. And finally, and most crucially, analyzing the intelligence, or as we call it now in modern parlance, connecting the dots. As we all know from this picture of the 9/11, it's famous. You know, they knew enough about these guys that if somebody would put it all together, they could figure out these a bunch of Arabs. They're Muslim. They're fanatic. They're taking flying school lessons. They're talking about, you know what I mean, dying and, and martyrdom and all the rest of it. And they want to know about the New York airplane schedule or whatever it was over there. Now, obviously, I'm not being 100% fair, but I really am. It's always easy after the fact. I do understand that. But professionals are supposed to be there to figure it out before the fact. You understand? So I'm just trying to say it's not simply somebody gives you information. One last point. You have the problem of what we call the double agent and the exquisitely tortuous mind games that can ensue. You get information, but you don't know if that's a disinformation that the other one's sending you by somebody pretending to be on your side. American intelligence had a famous history of the Golitsyn and the Senko back in the 60s, if anybody follows these things, where Anatoly Golitsyn was a Soviet diplomat who defected to the West and gave him all kind of information. And then another guy named Yuri Nusenko showed up, and he said, "Oh, Golitsyn's a liar, and all the information he gave you was wrong, and I'm the real one." And James D. Angleton, who was the head of the CIA counterintelligence for decades, was a very good friend of Israel, by the way, he got freaked out of who's really who. And, you said, the old line, "Why did you tell me you're going to Pinsk? Really, I know you're going to Minsk. You only told me to Pinsk. So I would think that you're going to Minsk, but really you're going to Pinsk." Like that. So you end up with a crazy situation. If I remember correctly, this guy was locked up in a glass cell or something crazy thing like that for like 3 years while they interrogate him and re-interrogate him and all the rest of it. I don't even remember how the end goes. Just goes to show you can get yourself in this whole. So the intelligence business is not simply a matter of getting information. You have to evaluate, you have to analyze, you have to do it, and it has to sink in. Now, in the case of Israel, intelligence gathering, meaning just getting the info, is something that Israel has excelled at since before the establishment of the state. I mean, here's Ezra Donin, whose father Ashkenaz, mother Sfard, so he knows the Middle East, and he was organizing the what we call the Haganah intelligence, something like that, Jewish agency intelligence on the Palestinians, other things in the Middle East, in the 30s, long before Israel came there. So people like Ben Gurion, Golda Meir, all the rest, they used to get intelligence analyses that were pretty good. You understand? So the Jews had Arab spies and informants all over the place. So they're good at that. Obviously, the piece de resistance is when you get somebody like Eli Cohen, which is, let's go back. Whoa, stop. Which is an extraordinary, that doesn't happen all the time, because he was Jewish, and they're able to fake it out that he should pretend to be Syrian, and rise so high before he was caught. I remember he was like almost deputy minister of defense or something like that. But that's extremely unusual, and really is due to the fact they had a politically chaotic situation in Syria at that time. You still do, but that time much more so, and it was before the internet where you could instantly check up somebody. You understand? That time you had to do a lot of homework and legwork if you really want to check somebody up. So he came in looking like he was a Syrian guy from Argentina or whatever, so he was able to bamboozle his way in there. In the period of 67 to 73, which is what we're looking at, the Mossad, which is one agency, and Amman, the Agaf Modi'in, what's called, which is the military intelligence, just like in this country, you got your CIA, your DIA, and that sort of thing. They're not the same, and they unfortunately were bitter rivals in those days. I say unfortunately because you need all your intelligence agencies to cooperate very heavily. Otherwise, spies and bad people can slip in through the seams in between. We had the same problem in this country, that the FBI and the CIA didn't trust each other for a long time. But naturally, the Israeli intelligence agencies had their regular spies in Egypt and vice versa. The Egyptians had their spies in Israel. These spies always provided low-level information that can be used by analysts to produce a picture of what's happening in the enemy camp. That's how the business works. You get somebody, you find out what's doing with their transportation, what they're doing with the bank stuff, and you get hopefully information about the schedules of the pilots, when they wake up and go to sleep and how many missions they're flying, things of that nature. However, is another type of spy of an altogether different caliber who is capable of providing very high-grade intelligence because of the spy's high level within the enemy camp. Now, Eli Cohen was an example of what I said before. That's most unusual that he was able, as a Jew, to fake his way in to rise so high. And like I say, it's only due to the nutty politics situation of the Ba'athist Party and all that business in early 1960s Syria. Usually these high-grade spies who betray their own native lands come from a certain set of backgrounds. One background is hashkafa, okay, ideology. These are famous cases in England, for example, Kim Philby and people like that, where nobody knew they were communists, but they were communists. So I get it. They're born British, but they had a loyalty to what they regard as a higher cause, communism. They believed in that stuff. And they're willing to totally betray their country because they're pursuing what you would call a logical goal. In other words, mitzidam, it makes sense. From their point of view, it makes sense. They're hard enough to discover, but a thorough examination would have discovered them. That's the shame on you to the British intelligence. For example, this is well known. Kim Philby, who rose to the top, I'm sorry, he was the head of counterintelligence for the British against the Soviets. So the Soviets had their guy at the top positions. He betrayed people right and left. You understand what I'm saying? He said, get this spy in Czechoslovakia and this British and American guy over here and that one over there. It's unbelievable. And they never quite figured it out. So how did this happen? This is famous. I mean, they make movies, they write books about this endlessly. Since he was a member of the upper class, so it was beyond the hasagas of the British MI5 and MI6 that somebody from their class could be a communist in that way and betray the country. So they never gave him a thorough examination. He claimed that, he was anti-communist and that he actually was sympathetic with Franco in the 30s. But he had been in Vienna in 1934 and had married a Jewish communist. That's her, Litzy Friedman. And Teddy Kollek had been at the Chazanah. Right? He writes about it. So, yeah, that's right. They were Jewish. So, somebody at the British thing, if there's a Cold War on, why don't you ever, do a little homework on who your head guy is? Has he ever shown any leftist sympathies? I mean, he married this communist girl to get her out of Hitler and get to England, and later on divorced her and helped her on her way in her communist activities. If he knew it, other people knew it. And no questions were asked. So I'm saying that in retrospect, it's a lack of due diligence, as we would say today. That's why people read spy novels and all that kind of business. But there are other super spies, who are basically impossible to discover. They betray their country for the hell of it. The amorality, their personal amorality, is beyond belief. We've had that. Who's this? Aldrich Ames and Hampson. They're two WASP guys or whatever they were. This guy was actually a strong Catholic from the wrong background. I mean, they came from American patriotic families. Everything clicked. They were not really communists. They did it. They just did it, for money and things like that. It makes no sense. You can't watch all your people all the time, unless you're Stalin. He said you can't watch everybody all the time. And so, how do you prevent? This guy rose very high in the FBI, and this guy's were very, very, very high in the CIA. And I think it's only because they overspent money. They were careless with their lifestyle. Like, what's this guy doing? A government salary with a Jaguar or something like that. No, that's what happened. If he would have played his cards a little more cleverly, he'd be there today. It's devastating. And the point is, when you have that kind of situation, there's a certain type of spy that's basically impossible to expect. Because what do you suspect everybody all the time, everywhere? It doesn't work like that. If you do that, you're dysfunctional. So you have a certain point to say, is some group within my society, my ruling class, my whatever, that he's okay, she's okay. These spies, if they're sufficiently high up, can do unbelievable damage, as these two did. okay? They betrayed so many American agents and, secrets and gave the Russians all of our nuclear stuff. It's just unbelievable, okay? And I'll say it again, it's not like Kim Philby, there was a secret, a communist, you feel you're serving a higher cause, and there's some justification for all the rest of it, whether you agree with that or not. But there's, here there's no way of telling. As it happens, in the years before the Yom Kippur War, 70, 73, Israel got lucky enough to get such an Egyptian spy working for Israel. Okay? This guy was a member of the Egyptian ruling class. He had absolutely no reason to do this whatsoever. It made no sense. And he gave away all the secrets of Egypt. He was like the Kim Philby of Egypt or whatever. It's unbelievable. Yeah, and I'll say it again. There's no way that the Egyptian or anybody else could figure that this would happen because it just made no sense. This is Ashraf Marwan. Okay, let's go to the next one. Yeah. So here's a fairy tale, from the next mini series. It's born in 1944, so that'll give you the idea of what we're talking about. Came from let's put it this way: his grandfather was the head of the Beis Din system of the Egyptian Sharia courts, of the Islamic business. He came from just the right, perfect family background, and fairly well-to-do, and member of the Egyptian upper class. And he's tall, dark, and handsome. He was, and he met at the tennis court when he was like 20 or something like that, because in Egypt there's a mass of poor people, but there's an upper crust. It's very interesting. Nasser didn't like them, but they still operated. And he, at the tennis court, met Nasser's daughter, was like 18. Now, Nasser really was Ozzy and Harriet. I mean, seriously, look at this. He was a modern guy, like I told you last year, modern Orthodox Islam. And you can kind of tell. And he had a lot of personal virtues. Unfortunately, he wanted to wipe out Israel. But I'm talking about from the Arab point of view. No, seriously now, because this is a serious story. And so this is a novel. And so he brought up his family. I'll tell you right now, Nasser did not live in a palace. He didn't take a big salary. Obviously, he had access to all the expenses he needs and things like that. He didn't live high in the hog on purpose. He did not hold of the rich and the fancy. He despised them. He went to the tennis club once in his life, and then he said, "This is a bunch of spendthrift, what's the right word? Useless millionaires and all this. This is junk." In his mind, he was a real socialist, and the people knew, and he was incorruptible. It's just interesting. In other words, he didn't have bank accounts elsewhere. Of course, he did set up a dictatorship with the secret police and all that. I mean, all that's true. I'm not going to deify him, but nevertheless, the virtues he had are quite remarkable, probably unique in the Arab world. And Ozzy and Harriet have 2 daughters, and among others, you have the older one, Hoda, who's the good daughter, right? Looks like a from family. He says she was the studious one, and she went on to get a PhD in something and marry an Egyptian from a middle class family who also got a PhD, I think, in political analysis. And they had a job, and they didn't live high and fancy, very honorable, and so forth and so on. They didn't want for anything, had a secure situation, but they did by merit. And then he had the other daughter, Mona. Okay, that's her over there. That's the mother, and that's the thing. It's a short sleeve. I told you, the modern Orthodox. Now, Nasser, well, in the Islamic world today, see, believe me, whoever's in charge of Egypt is not going to let his wife be photographed like that. Okay? Now, Mona was, a ditzy girl, and she was the opposite of the other girl, and she falls for the tall, dark, and handsome guy on the tennis court. All right? And so she tells her father, this is the guy for me. She's only 17 or 18. And the father basically says, "You're making a mistake. I can tell at one spot, he's like one of these gigolo types or something like that, and, a lizard, and he's just marrying you for fame and money and all that." No, we're all in love and all the rest of it. And let's put it this way. There was a big scene between Nasser, the dictator of Egypt, and the daughter won. Because she said, "I want to marry," like that. And so they had the wedding. They tried to put a good front up on it. but he was very unhappy with the son-in-law. Not the first time or the last time. This doesn't happen in Baltimore, though. And when the son-in-law, Taka married her for the, rise in power, but Nasser said, I guess you're getting a job, like we'd say today, for $50,000 a year, you're going to live in a very modest situation. I'm not going to let my daughter and son-in-law take advantage of their being related, to me and all the rest of it. And the trouble is, both of them, the type of people I'm describing, they want to live it up. So if they go to London, they spend a lot of money, but they don't have money. So they end up going to Arab sheiks and borrowing money from them, which is a bizyonis for Nasser, the sheik of Kuwait and things like that. Other Arab countries happens every day, but he was shocked by this. He brings them both back from Egypt. He insists that the daughter divorce the husband. She says, I'm not going to divorce the husband. And she wins, okay? And so by the time you get to a year or two into the marriage and she has a daughter, so the father-in-law and the son-in-law hate each other passionately. And that's the reason he said, the heck with you. I'm going to go and mess over you and the whole thing, but in the worst way, by spying for Israel. Now go figure that out. This ain't exactly for ideological purposes. But here comes almost the best part. So this is in the middle of 1970, and he goes to London, he calls up the Israeli embassy. They don't answer the call. They think he's a phony. It can't be. In other words, some Egyptian guy says, I can give you high-level information. In the spy business, you get these kind of things all the time. So anyway, like I said, can you make this up? So that didn't work. But like a month or two after this attempt, is it okay? Okay. A month or two after this attempt, he tries again. Well, because, a month or two after this attempt, the father-in-law dropped dead. Doesn't get better than that. Nasser died from the diabetes. And he goes to London again. Now, a guy like this can go back and forth to London. They don't check the passports and all. He's a VIP. And this time, somebody at the Israeli embassy says somebody else, some jerk named Asher Marwan. Asher, that's Nasser's son-in-law, So they meet up, they contact him, and they're astonished. Because the person I'm describing makes no sense that he should want to spy for Israel. He's not a Zionist. To make things even more interesting, now comes Sadat. Sadat, in order to consolidate his power, he says, it's very good for me to have Nasser's son-in-law next to me because that'll look like I'm being legitimated and the real successor and heir to Gamal Abdel Nasser. The public doesn't know that they hated each other, the father-in-law and the son-in-law. As far as the public knows, he's married to Nasser's Tochter. So, this is very good. As a result, Sadat takes him to the very height, meaning he got a job as assistant to Sadat that he would never have gotten under his father-in-law. You understand? He really becomes like his close aide. So, Israel couldn't dream this up in 100 years. And under, basically, he's the Egyptian Kim Philby, as I told you before. And he comes to Israel, doesn't even ask for money. He says, here, you want all the army information? Here it is. Bring it back to me tomorrow. Yeah. He said, you have the original documents. Don't worry, they don't check me. Want the Air Force stuff? Here's the Air Force stuff. You want this stuff? And here's what Sadat told me last week and all the rest of it. He continues to spy for Israel copiously, even after he becomes rich, under Sadat's less financially puritanical regime. In other words, when he first met Israel, he didn't bring up money, but Israel ended up paying him, I don't even get this, paying him something like 10 grand, 12 grand. How much is that? That's bupkis. Even though I know in 1970 it's more today. How much is 10,000 in 1970 today? 20, 30? Not more than 30, I don't think. Right? Agree? Something like that. It's not a fortune. And he's giving $1 million material. You understand? $1 million material. And you might say like this, okay, he needed help because he's one of these guys, like in these movies. He blows everything in a roulette wheel, He liked the high life. That's who he was. He liked the high life. And before he died, he was a billionaire. Just want you to know. So he knew this kind of a shtick. But once Sadat comes into power, Sadat was not like Nasser at all. I don't know if he personally stole, but his wife stole right and left. And, whereas Nasser's wife didn't. And all the people around him, they used to call him Mr. 1%, Mr. 2%. No, it's a 1% of a government contract. It's a 2% of a government contract. What are you talking about? Gigantic amounts of money. So he got in with that business. So then it really doesn't make any sense. You're becoming a millionaire from there. Why are you spying for Israel? Nobody has an answer to this question to this day. You understand? I mean, there are theories, but it really does make sense. Precisely because it makes no such sense, that's why he's such a brilliantly successful spy. Because you're at head of the Egyptian counterintelligence. So I guess, no, he wouldn't do it. I mean, why would he spy for Israel? I mean, I know, but his family's not Jewish. That's the only explanation, right? So he can't be a spy. But what about this guy or that one? And so it makes no sense, but Golda Meir and the Israeli government is so turned on by this that she shared. I mean, let's put it this way: when Sadat goes to the Kremlin, he's there and he keeps the notes. And then when he flies back, he stops in London and gives Israel the notes. So I mean, where do you get this kind of information? Golda Meir shares the records of the Kremlin conversation with an amazed Nixon and Kissinger. Of course, what does it do? They say, I guess, Kissinger figures like this: the Mossad is unbelievable. You see? They don't get it that there's just some dumb luck thing from anywhere, and it's very good for the Mossad, for Israel, because it builds up the reputation. You know, they're everywhere. They have listening posts. They got Sadat's office bugged up at their base. You know, I tell you the honest truth. I myself know a little bit more than others about it. So years ago, I read how they had the verbatim transcript of something from the tent of Gaddafi, and I was thinking to myself, how the heck did Israel get? I'm talking about in the 80s, early 90s. I read this. I figured, how did they get in the tent? The Mossad must be unbelievable. I was a dummy like everybody else. This guy gave them all the info. You see? So we're talking about top secrets over here. Before I show you the next thing, the CBS, after this guy died by falling off a hotel balcony, we'll talk about that not tonight though. Many years later, way 35 years, something like after the Yom Kippur War. There's a whole long story with that. But then the question became like this: was he? Who was this guy? What kind of a spy was he? I'll just give you a little bit of previews of coming attractions, even though I shouldn't. And if you're Egyptian, how do you handle this today? Because after all, I'm telling you something shocking, well beyond Kim Philby. How do you think the British feel about Kim Philby today? What idiots he made them look like. See, if you're Egypt, 10 times as much, so they deny it. You get it? So what they really say like this: really, he was a double agent working for Egypt all the time, even though they know better. But that's how it works in that part of the world. You understand? So what I'm telling you, nobody knew until very recently. All the old books you read in the Yom Kippur War are false, and they're put out by Israeli and other actors, meaning high-level people, to protect themselves. As we'll talk about not tonight, but hopefully next time. And there's a lot of false and misinformation out there. Only with the passage of time and certain factors and research has the quote-unquote truth come out. But the Arab world still doesn't believe it, because it's, they would have to say Nasser's son-in-law did it. They can't handle that. Understand? Can't handle that. So the CBS, the 60 Minutes or something like that, in 2009, had a whole long piece on this guy, and I'll show you just a piece of it.
It's a tale rooted in nearly 40 years of history and a distant war. And as you will see, there are two different versions. Both of them began in 1969, not long after the Israelis routed invading Arab armies in the Six-Day War, capturing the West Bank from Jordan, the Golan Heights from Syria, and the Sinai Peninsula from the Egyptians. Another war to recapture the lost territory was already brewing when a tall, elegant, 26-year-old Egyptian contacted Israeli intelligence in London and offered to provide them his country's most important military secrets.
It was for us something unbelievable.
Major General Aharon Farkash was until recently Israel's director of military intelligence.
In our work of intelligence, we are very suspicious about everything. So we try to ask different questions about everything that we know. And after years, we understood this is a piece of gold.
Piece of gold.
Yes.
In the annals of spies for Israel, where does Marwan rank?
He was the best. He was the best.
At the time, Aharon Lebron was one of Israel's highest-ranking intelligence officers, one of only a select few with access to the information that Marwan provided.
was a bonanza. It was a masterpiece of information
Like having somebody,
in the bed of the ruler.
Actually, Marwan was in the bed of the ruler's daughter. He was the son-in-law of Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, and Nasser's liaison to the Egyptian intelligence services.
why do you think he became an Israeli spy?
It was money, it was adventure, it was a special character.
The
Those he
meeting
doesn't
took
know.
place in a London safe house near the Dorchester Hotel under the direct supervision of the head of Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service. According to the Israelis, part of Marwan's motivation was a deep hatred of the Soviet Union, which was Egypt's major ally, military patron, and chief arms supplier. But the Israelis say Marwan also demanded more than $100,000 per meeting to finance what they claim was a lavish London lifestyle that included wine, gambling, and women.
He was for sale,
In a way,
and Israel paid him very well.
it was worth every penny.
The Mossad's code name for Marwan was the Angel.
Okay, like I say, if you want, you can actually look it up yourselves on the YouTube or something. That's where I found it. A lot of that's baloney. You understand what I'm saying? You know, I don't think he did it for money and all the rest. The guy became a millionaire, times 10, times 20, times 50. It's a good question. As they say in the yeshiva, the kasha better than the teretz. You understand? And this really magnifies the disaster of the Israeli being surprised on Yom Kippur. You get it? As part of Sadat's inner circle, Ashraf Marwan tells the Mossad that the Sadat is committed to recovering the Sinai, and he means it by diplomacy or war. As 1971 and 72 proceed, it becomes clear that diplomacy is not working. Right? Nixon is not delivering the goods. Not happening. But war is not pashut. Egypt in 71 and 72 lacks the most modern Soviet weapons. They basically give them their B-level stuff, not their A-level stuff. That's who the Russians were. And the Soviets say, number one, don't go to war with Israel, you're going to lose. Number two, if you go to war, it'll drag in thousands of Soviet soldiers and personnel, and that'll get us involved in a war with Nixon, and it will ruin the détente that we're building up, which we hope will be good for Russia. Sadat responds, number one, if you give us your newest weapons, the SAM-6, the Sagers, the newest MiGs, the new ones, and the T-62 tanks, we'll long go from T-34, you know, they had the T-50, no, the newest tanks, then we won't lose. And number two, get the heck out of Egypt, get out of our way, and that way you won't be dragged in. And that's the real meaning of Sadat expelling the Russians in 1972. Nobody hopped it at the time, okay? The whole world misunderstood. It wasn't that he was turning on the Russians, like we all thought, but he was getting them out of the way so that now he can have a war. Now, Ashraf Marwan knew all this. As a result, the Mossad knew all this. So did the military intelligence, the Aman as they call it in Israel. As a result, the military intelligence and the Mateh Klali, the general staff, became convinced that although Sadat wanted to go to war, he realized he was unable to do so because of the superiority of the Israeli Air Force and the superiority of the Israeli Tank Corps, the Armor Corps. This was soothing to Israel's nerves, too soothing. And the result is they formed what they call in Israel the conceptia, right? The concept, which means there is no way Egypt will go to war. Israel's too strong, even if they say they will, even if Egypt takes military steps that seem to indicate war, it's a bluff because they know Israel would win. Now, listen very closely, I'm going to tell you. He told them this in 71 and 72. It was true then. Then, when things changed, he told them things have changed. They wouldn't accept it. That's the story what happened. Okay? These notions, as I say before, it was in the French they call it the idée fixe, fixed idea. That let's go to the next one, that you're just hooked on. Okay? This was the head, General Zaira, of Israeli military intelligence. He was a guy that fought in all the wars from the Palmach up, like that. one of the Moshe Dayan guys. He was a heroic figure on the battlefield, but he was the wrong guy, turns out, unfortunately, for military intelligence. He's still alive today, and he still claims he was right. He said, how did Israel get fooled? The guy was really a spy for Egypt, fooling us. In other words, that shows you how the human mind can deny facts in order to justify. I mean, here, 50 years later, 40 years later, he's still tying that. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you something which is really disgusting. He was so angry as books came out decade after decade that he outed the guy. He told reporters it's Ashraf Marwan, and a few days later he fell off the cliff, the apartment building. What do you call it? The hotel. You see? So in other words, and when that happened, the head of the Mossad, who was the one who was dealing with this guy, sued. There was a famous case in Israel 10 years ago. 10 years ago. He sued General Zaira for breaking secrets and things like that. And what the court said in the end was, well, the Supreme Court in Israel said, well, yeah, since he's done so much for Israel's defense over the years, let him alone, which is very bad. And both of these guys are still alive today. General Zamir was the head of the Mossad, and General Zaira was the head of the military intelligence. And General Zamir to this day is very, very bitter. And he said, I'll take this to, and I said, he goes, we murdered our best spy. And it goes to show you the spy business is a lousy world. These notions held up to the end of 72, like I said. In 1971, 72, the Russians were not giving them the top grade stuff. All that is correct. In 1973, things changed, and the Soviets agreed to send the newest weapons, the Sagar missiles and the T-62s and all that business. This is a game changer. In addition, the Egyptian general, Shazli, he was their top guy, the only really good general, he devised a realistic war plan. Not something crazy, something we could do. And that was the one that became the Egyptian war plan, which is very simple. Just instead of trying to conquer the whole Sinai Desert and get into Israel, which is crazy, just do this right here, just a little bit, 5 miles, 4 miles, along here, just like that. If we can hold this out, then even though Israel holds everything else, we struck a gigantic blow to Israel's psychology, and it'll start the peace process happening in reality, which did work, and we will have won a major victory over the Israelis. The very fact that we can do a little bit. Now, the reason you can do a little bit is you bring the SAM missiles all the way up to here, and then they shoot out for about 4 or 5 miles, 6 miles, something like that. And when you have that, the Israeli planes can't help the Israeli infantry and armor. And you land a bunch of soldiers with those joystick things, and Israel can't win. So we do not have to, if we redefine victory, very smart, we redefine victory in a realistic way, we don't have to take on a giant process that we can't do. That's a genius in the military sense. You get very real on what you're able to do, but do it. And unfortunately, Egypt, as we all know, did this. This is a radically new reality. War now is not only possible, but it's certain it's going to happen. 73, the guy's telling them, this is coming down the line, guys. We're getting the new weapons. They're having new types of exercises with the new weapons. This is coming. Israel is being kept totally informed every step of the way. I mean, here's Sadat signing a secret agreement with Gaddafi in the old days, so that, listen to this, the Israelis had the Mirage airplanes, so Egypt can't buy them from France, but Libya can. So secretly, Libya will send them to Egypt. So they'll have not only Russian planes, but they'll have the French planes, even though it's breaking the contract. Who's the guy that negotiated the deal? The spy, Ashraf Marwan, because his job was to handle relations with Libya and Saudi Arabia. So he's telling Israel this is what's coming down the line. Armed with this foreknowledge, Israel has the capacity to deliver a powerful counterstroke. I mean, if you know what's coming, then you're the non-static one. Right? If I know what you're going to do, then I can design a perfect counter strategy. But it does not register. It does not register. It's not enough to know. You have to be makabelet, as they say. this is something interesting in the history of science, where a new idea, a new invention comes out. I'll just give you an example. One year they came out with the heart transplant. It took like 10 years for it to get around the world. See, because it's just, there's a lag time. And here, it was even worse. So this is an extraordinary human story. But my friends, the hour is late. I got to go to Israel. So we'll leave on this regard. There are none who are as blind as those who will not see. So stay tuned for the next episode. But remember, I'm not here next week. Good night.